Good evening. We've had a long day, but a good day, and it's going to continue to be good this evening with our speaker. I was just speaking earlier because Michael asked me to chair this because he said, you've done Labour history. And I thought, well, that's 30 odd years ago. But one of the things that, reflecting on that, I thought about is that the historians at the time were very misleading because there were Churches of Christ people, but they called them Baptists. And there's no danger this evening that our speaker is going to fall into that particular trap. As you can see, our speaker, Peter Ackers, is Emeritus Professor in the History of Industrial Relations at Loughborough University. He's a member of the Society, and I looked back and saw that he published a couple of articles in the journal, a 1997 article on Exodus, Labour Immigration from the English Churches of Christ to Canada, and a 1993 one on Who Speaks for the Christians, the Great War and Conscientious Objectors in the Churches of Christ. And I'm hoping that in 2025 we will see another article in the journal. You can see that the title this evening is The Churches of Christ, and of course those of you who are avid readers of the journal will know that we don't often get articles about Presbyterianism, let alone Churches of Christ. So we look forward not only to hearing them, but in due course reading on the Churches of Christ and the early 20th century British movement. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for turning out after such a long day and everything. I mean, I started off as a straightforward industrial relations specialist, and then sort of stumbled into religious history of circa 1990. So some of my stuff starts very early as well. And I was just looking at Clyde, and I was thinking. I remember going to a Chapel Society meeting, and I was using the expression non-conformism, and you said to me, no, it's non-conformity. so whenever I come across someone who says non-conformism, people still do every now and then. You always think, oh no. So that's how I started to learn the language of non-conformity, if you like. So I'm going to start, in a sense, from a different end. I'm not going to start with non-conformity. I'm going to start with British Labour movement. And when people looked at the British Labour movement, they thought there's something funny about the British Labour movement. And you've got Halevi now, the French historian who wrote a history of England, of the English people in the 19th century. In 1913, he says, with a certain amount of astonishment, the majority of leaders of the great trade union movement that would arise in England within a few years of 1815 would belong to the nonconformist sects. They will often be local preachers. Their spiritual ancestors were the founders of Methodism. So for a lot of continental socialist type academics and even non-socialists, this was surprising. And then you've got this great quote, which I was lucky just to pick this up in The Guardian years ago, from Robert Moore, who you'll see in a minute, wrote a very important study up here in The Guardian. He said the earliest Labour MPs were not jolly friar types, they were local preachers, teetotalers and working class intellectuals. Even if they found them personally uncongenial, the local voters pitched out of the pubs and clubs to vote for them because they recognised the merits of orderliness, honesty and intellectual self-discipline in their representatives. I'm very glad I found that letter that he wrote to The Guardian. So this is obviously the right place to do this talk. It's the perfect place to do this talk if you're looking at it from a Labour history point of view, because Labour history is obsessed with primitive Methodism. So Durham primitive Methodism is the main focus of this debate about non-conformity in the Labour movement in Britain. I don't think that's much of an oversimplification. There you've got a banner. It's always interesting how similar that looks to a trade union banner. I always think, you see that banner? A local colliery. And there's Sam Watson, who's probably the last of a generation of Labour and Durham Miners leaders, and it's quite remarkable if you look at the Durham Miners Association and the Northumberland Miners, that how dominated they were by Methodists, mainly primitive Methodists, but not only primitive Methodists, and that includes the first Lib Lab MPs and later on Labour MPs, you know, so there's this sort of very, very powerful influence in this area. There's no denying that. And you've obviously got this famous quote by Morgan Phillips, the post-war General Secretary of the Labour Party. The Labour Party owes more to Methodism than Marxism. It's quite a famous quote. But there is a problem with this type of perspective on nonconformity, is that it's obsessed with Methodism, and it's not just obsessed with Methodism, it's obsessed with primitive Methodism, one particular part of Methodism, you know. So someone like Arthur Henderson, probably the most important Methodist, was a Wesleyan. So it leads to a certain lack of complexity in the way people look at nonconformity. So the key literature is much more narrowly focused on the Prims. And I think the point to make there also is that the Prims were very strong in certain industries. They were very strong in, well, two industries basically. They were very strong in coal, and they were very strong among farm labourers, you know, Joseph Arch and people like that. Well, there are two big industries at the turn of the 20th century, very big industries, employing a lot of people. But it doesn't give you a full picture of the English working classes. And there's a series of books which are classics, and there's been more stuff recent, but I still think this is the classic literature in a way. Wearmouth, who comes from up this part of the world, did a remarkable job of going around and collecting the names of all these trade union leaders and stuff like this. He did the empirical work, did a whole series of books. And then even someone like Eric Hobsbawm, who wasn't very keen on religion, he's been a Marxist and everything, but he was a good enough historian to see that there was something here that was interesting and important. And he wrote a series of articles in some of his books on the labour sex. So the idea that the way this was created, which is another simplification, the idea that this is all about labour sex. It's about certain groups that are predominantly labour. And again, that's another oversimplification. Moore's book, Pitman Preachers and Politics, is a brilliant book, a study, again, up here, of a mining community. And an old colleague of mine, Robert Cole's Primitive Methodism in the Northern Coalfield. And they're all kind of saying something similar. They're all saying that primitive Methodists produced a certain type of trade union leader, and it's all about leadership. I'll come back to that a little bit later. I suppose the question then you say is, well, what about the other nonconformists? What about the URC traditions and other traditions outside, you know? Do they matter? Are they of any significance? Or is it all about Methodism? So that's the sort of set of questions I'll come back to. Now, the labour history debate is I think there's sort of four elements to it. The first element is, why were these Bible Christians central to the rise of the working class? That's the first question. What type of leadership qualities, I suppose, it often leads to? And then another question, which I'm not going to talk about too much tonight, is when did this leadership role decline? Was it the end of the 19th century? Or was it actually the middle of the 20th century? And I think one of the problems with labour historians is so many socialist labour historians, particularly Marxist labour historians, they want to get religion out of the way as fast as possible. They do not want religion coming into the 20th century, you know. And so there's been an exaggerated secularisation argument a lot of the time. How far was it limited to the Methodist labour sects, or was there something more complex going on? And how did Chapel prepare these people? And we're talking about, I mean, there's no getting away from this. This is about men. You know, you can't put a particular feminist angle on this. This is a very male world, basically. So how far did they prepare them, and what sort of politics did these people espouse? How did their religion, and this is something I've come back to recently, and I'm just writing something at the moment, how did religion actually influence the type of politics? Is there anything distinctive about the type of politics because of their Christian religion? And that's something I'll come back to in the talk. So I think the first thing to say, it's obvious that the nonconformist effect was much wider than any primitive labour sect. And there's certain elements that I'll try and pull into the argument. One would be that the organisation of skilled workers, radical democratic ideas and Christian nonconformity are kind of tied up. They're quite, more broadly. Obviously, the Methodist evangelical revival reshaped a lot of the old dissent. So, Baptists and Congregationalists became much more emotional in their approach to faith, which made them more popular. I did a talk last week at the Unitarian Chapel in Leicester, and I didn't want to say, you actually, when you became incredibly rationalistic, you became rather unpopular among ordinary people, So an evangelical revival made the old dissent more popular among the masses, if you like. And but the other side of the coin is congregational ideas of democratic church government, reshaped Methodism, and most of the splits, as I understand it, I'm not a great expert on Methodism, but a lot of the splits are about church government, and those sort of arguments. Oh, too far. I just use this example from my PhD. When I did my PhD, I looked at I had a table in it looking at the Wigan mining MPs, who were all miners' representatives. They were all local miners' representatives. And if you look at the names here, going down, and I did by religion, and you see they're not primitive Methodists, they're quite a mixture of people. You've got a Wesleyan, you've got a Baptist, you've got a couple of Anglicans. Nobody really talks much about Anglicans and the Labour movement, and that could be quite an interesting topic in its own right. And then you've got 3 Congregationalists in the interwar period. So there is a bigger story, and that's just a little microcosm, but there's a bigger story to tell about this. And I don't know, because I don't know the literature so much in Congregationalism and stuff, I don't know maybe people know of important works that have done this, but I think there's more work to be done looking at other nonconformists and their contribution to the Labour movement. Okay, so how did I come into it? I wandered into this debate through my 1993 PhD biography, my great-granddad. I was having a bit of a sort of political crisis. I'd been in the Communist Party in the 80s. I was a Euro-communist. I was having a bit of a political crisis, and I went back to look at my sort of family traditions, which I knew were in the Labour movement. And primarily I went to do a trade union study, really. And he was National Secretary of the Colliery Deputies Union, what became NACODS. And then I found out that he was also a very active member of the Church of Christ in Flatbridge in Wigan. And as a boy, I've had memories of being taken back to this chapel in an upper room in the centre of Wigan, whenever some relation in the Ackers or Miller family died. So it was in my sort of trace memory, if you like. And the interesting thing I found when I started doing research on W.T. Miller was that, this backstreet Bethel, I got them, in those days you could wander into the Selly Oak colleges and just pull the records off the shelves. I got the Flatbridge minutes and stuff and found that this backstreet Bethel, to use the term from Hugh MacLeod, who's one of my supervisors, was full of Labour activists, not just Clay, not just Miller, but other Labour activists. And this seemed to me to be where he learned his sort of leadership skills. So I'll just say a little bit about the Church of Christ. I know this is going to be really, a lot of you will know all this stuff, and I thought I ought to say who they are, basically, and what they stood for. So the Church of Christ, and obviously David Thompson's book was a very important starting point for me when I started doing this research. It gave me the big picture, if you like. The Churches of Christ were, what people often call them new primitives or new sectarians. So they arrived later than most nonconformist groups in the 19th century, and they peak late as well. So they peak in 1930. with 16,596 members. What are the main things they believe in? Rejection of any church authority or creeds beyond the New Testament, the idea of they're a restoration movement, the idea of restoring primitive New Testament Christianity. So a lot of the chapels just say Christians. So that they've got an incredibly low denominational profile. So people often don't know, when they see a chapel, they don't know it's a Churches of Christ chapel because it doesn't advertise it very clearly. It's sort of anti-denomination, if you like. Congregational government, mutual ministry, no full-time ministers is a big part of their original plea, although they do have evangelists who are employed for periods of time. A rational version of adult believers' baptism, the closed Sunday morning Lord's Supper, which is just for members, and then a gospel service in the evening. And the other interesting thing about them, you might say there's a lot of things here look a bit like the primitive brethren or whatever. But the other thing about them that's interesting is where they're located. They're just in the right place at the right time. You know, they're in all the major, well, not all, they're in one or two really major industrial centres, particularly in the industrial north and in the Midlands, and that's where most of my stuff has been done. So there is a sense of, you know, whereas something like the Plymouth Brethren are often in rural areas in the south of England and stuff, the Churches of Christ are located where the emerging labour movement is, basically. So they're a restoration movement against mainstream nonconformity in the Church of England. But one of the things I tried to pull out, influenced by Hugh MacLeod, was this idea that there were West End chapels and backstreet Bethels, that it wasn't a simple move, it wasn't a simple Labour sect. They weren't all on the same level. Like all these groups, you know, so the primitive Methodists have Hartley's Jam, don't they, who pays for their college and all that sort of stuff. All these groups are quite socially differentiated. And my argument was that the backstreet Bethels tended to produce Labour leaders, and they were more that the backstreet Bethels, and might be an uncomfortable argument for some people. Backstreet Bethels were both more democratic and, in some senses, more fundamentalist. They were more old-fashioned Bible Christians. Obviously, there's the 20th century. There's a sort of set, you know, to use the sociological language, there's a sort of sect to denomination development, which leads to the biggest part of the group going into the URC. So during that movement, you get a more liberal theology, more ecumenical, more paid ministers, theology college, instrumental music, open communion. You get, if you're looking at it from the point of view of some people, you're getting a dilution of what their original vision was, if you like. And then obviously you get a backlash, so there's a lot of splits and divisions within the movement, and the most obvious one is the Old Paths group during the First World War, and that's when I wrote that piece about conscientious objection. A lot of the conscientious objectors were Old Paths people that rejected a lot of this liberal Christianity, if you like, and they were predominantly working class chapels that did so. So in a sense, they're resisting the move to mainstream free church type status. Moira did this embroidery for me, which is the Wigan chapels that I looked at. And they've got a nice quote in the middle that the assumption of distinctive titles or honorary names other than those found in the New Testament by the brethren, however gifted, devout or useful, is contrary to Christian humility and the equality of the brotherhood and not to be tolerated. And these are the chapels that I mainly did my early work on. Rodney Street in 1858 was founded. That's the start of the movement in Wigan. Rodney Street's interesting because I got the trustees, and the trustee, I mean, they were a group that didn't want to have a sort of creedal statement, but to have trustees, you've got to have some sort of creedal statement. So the trustees actually have a list of beliefs, which I've got around the outside here. And then I looked at two other chapels, Albert Street, where the Ackerses went to, 1878, I think that one is, and Platt Bridge. where the Millers, the other side of my family, went to 1883, I think that is. And they were both in the coalfields. Now, I think the important point is that I've used the term Labour sect in some of my articles, but the important thing is this was no simple Labour sect. And in fact, there weren't, as far as I'm aware, any simple Labour sects as far as nonconformity is concerned. I mean, and there's some quite sort of paradoxical things here. You get I reviewed a book on the Labour churches. Now, most of the Labour churches didn't have many working class people in them. You know, so there's a sort of paradox about the way people use these sort of concepts. So there were no simple Labour sect. And in the case of Wigan, which is a bit distinctive, they had a very large employer. He wasn't a very larger employer when they started off in 1858, but he became he had a big factory in the centre of Wigan, and he funded the expansion of the churches. And the other thing to link to that is that they weren't homogeneously Labour movement people. Their lives varied. So this is my granddad, who was always a working class Tory. He began in the Wigan Chapel and did a craft apprenticeship on the shop floor in a mining engineering company. And he's a good example of another aspect of nonconformities, you know, individual upward social mobility. But again, it's important to recognise, even in his case, it was aided by collective institutions. So I have published an article, which, you know, a book chapter, which was how my granddad, the Churches of Christ and the Steam Engine Makers Society lifted my family into the professional classes. Because that's what he did. And he became an engineer and a factory manager. So there's one example. Another example, which doesn't fit in the simple thing, is another one which, as you were saying at the start, most people said this guy was a Welsh Baptist. Well, he wasn't a Welsh Baptist. He probably one of the most important communist trade union leaders in Britain, Arthur Horner, leader of the eventually NUM General Secretary, who made a transition from the Churches of Christ to communism. Now, that's quite interesting. Now, Horner was an evangelist at the Churches Training College in Birmingham, so he went to Overdale College. But then in the First World War, during all that conflict about conscientious objection, he became a conscientious objector and eventually joined the CPG and in 1920 and broke with Christianity altogether. And I think a friend of mine, Mike Casey from America, found out this. He rang me up from Wales and said, "Peter, have you heard of Arthur Horner?" And he'd been going around talking to Churches of Christ people in Wales, and they mentioned Arthur Horner. And so we wrote an article together about Arthur Horner. And one of the interesting things was how he made this transition from biblical literalism to Marxism-Leninism. You know, it was like a sort of almost quite a similar language, quite a similar way of understanding the world. So that's another strand. But he's not typical, because most of my guys that I talk about, like W.T. Miller, were very moderate. You know, so they weren't. They were the right wing of the Labour movement. They weren't massively hostile to employers. You know, that they wanted to work with good employers and stuff like that. So he's not typical, but it shows you the sort of variation, if you like. So far, it's a story of coal mining trade unions. It's a story of Wigan, South Wales. There are other examples in Fife. So you've got quite a lot of chapels in Fife in the coal mining areas, and there's more work could be done up there. But the other thing I started looking at, strangely living in Loughborough, I didn't actually bother looking at Leicester for quite a long time. It's just down the road. But Leicester offers an interesting comparison and contrast, because again, there was a very large concentration of Churches of Christ chapels in Leicester. Almost 10% of the national membership were actually in Leicester. But it's a very different industry. I mean, Leicester basically was hosiery and boot and shoe in the late 19th century. But most of the Churches of Christ people were in boot and shoe. There's a few small employers. There are employers, but they're not as big as, say, Coop. But more interestingly, in a way, was that Leicester was a national centre for the worker cooperatives. So most of the cooperative movement, which is the third wing of the labour movement, most of the cooperative movement is retail cooperation. But in Leicester, there was like quite a concentration of worker cooperatives, and it was the main administrative centre for the worker cooperative movement. If you like, the third wing of the labour movement. And this is where I found my next bunch of figures. Leicester, two key figures in Leicester. There was the first big worker cooperative in Leicester was called Equity, and it only closed about 10 years ago or something. And it was part of what was called a cooperative co-partnership movement. So it wasn't, the workers didn't entirely own the company. There were other people who had shares, like some of the cooperative retailers would have shares in it and stuff like that. But in these cooperatives in Leicester, they basically ran it. You know, they were the dominant democratic force in it. And so these two are quite interesting because not only did they have a boot and shoe cooperative, but then they actually built a garden suburb on the outskirts of Leicester. Quite remarkable. And two guys, Amos Mann, who was quite a big wheel in the cooperative movement more generally, and he was a lib lab. He was a liberal with Labour sort of, you know, Labour movement sympathies and stuff. And they were both members of the Boot and Shoe Union. J.T. Taylor belonged to the ALP, the Independent Labour Party, so he was technically more radical, if you like, more socialist. But they were very, very close. Now these figures are interesting because, I was going to say a little bit more about the churches in Leicester. So here you see the picture of the church, the movement developing in Leicester. Now, interestingly, the first church was in Loughborough, where I live, in 1842. I think the first church in the country was in Nottingham, and then it moved, and then Loughborough came out of Nottingham. And then you got a series. The next church was Crafton Street, which we'll come to in a minute in Leicester. And then you see a spread of a whole group of churches. And you see the gradual, you know, you see the period it goes from 1842 to 1909, 1910, 1910. That's the period of the expansion of the movement, if you like. Now the interesting thing also, yes, there is a period when you get secularisation, when the churches start to decline, but it's interesting how late it is. So the Leicester movement in numerical terms peaks in 1936. So it's quite late secularisation, so almost up to the Second World War, if you like. And interestingly, of these, this chapel just in Loughborough, this fits my Backstreet Bethel model. This is still going. This was an old Paths chapel that broke away quite early on, and that's still going. Most of the others, I'd be interested if people know anything about the others. That I think they've all gone, but if people know any, I'd be interested to know. Now, Crafton Street was where these boot and shoe people were, and a group of boot and shoe workers in the trade union met and decided to form a worker cooperative. And this was the Anchor Worker Cooperative. Some of them came from Equity, the first worker cooperative. And there you see there's quite a big factory in Leicester. But then probably the most interesting part, which is a bit more unusual, is that they went on to try to build what is called Humberston Garden Suburb. Now, a lot of people don't know about this place. It's out on the edge of Leicester. And they built it in 1910, and you see there's the Christian meeting house, and there's the cooperative offices and stuff there, and that's still going. It's still the meeting house isn't still going, but the housing cooperative is still being run as a housing cooperative, and another Christian group had taken over the meeting house. By the way, I think that's probably one of the most architecturally stylish Churches of Christ chapels that I've seen. Because they were very influenced by the sort of Garden City movement and stuff like this. They were influenced by Cadbury and Lever and these sort of ideas. And they built, that's 19, this is early in the 20th century, before council housing. They built semi-detached houses for skilled working class families, basically. Another episode which is, I say I've written about is the Great War conscientious objection movement, which is centred in, my original article was about Wigan, but I've looked a little bit more at Leicester, and Leicester was also a centre of it. So there's quite a sizable and cohesive conscientious objection movement, which began in Wigan. But it was a sort of, it's not the fashionable conscientious objectors, the middle class people and stuff like this. It's obscure provincial, it's coal miners, people like that. And it's divided by class and theology. So the church is divided. Some of the elders of the church are actually on the magistrate committees that have to deal with the conscientious objectors. So there's quite a lot of internal tension goes on. I mean, this is from David's book, I think, 125 people, 61 arrested, 12 spent a year plus in prison. It's rather otherworldly type movement. But I just wanted to tie this in to the people I'm talking about, because here's, in April 1916, 7 young men sought total exemption, and they were supported by Amos Mann, this cooperator, this guy who was involved in Humberston Garden City. And Amos Mann said at the time, war was absolutely wrong. The teaching of Christ said not merely love one another, but love your enemies. And you get a similar comment later on with J.T. Taylor looking back on not long before his death actually, looking back on the history of the movement. He says, and this is in the Old Paths publication, I'm reminded of what occurred 70 years ago in the Church of Christ at Crafton Street, Leicester. 2 young men enlisted in the local regiment. A meeting of church members was called. On the recommendation of the oversight, they were separated from the fellowship of the church for acting contrary to the teaching of the Prince of Peace. So he's reminding this old fundamentalist, pacifist type background to the church. Now, where am I taking this now? In a sense, what's new to say about it? Now, at the end of 2016, I edited a book with Alistair Reid called Alternatives to State Socialism. And what I'm trying to do at the moment is to actually look a bit more positively about the ideas people have. So to say, well, it's not just about them producing leaders, but these leaders had visions of society which are interesting. So I've coined the term Christian labourism and suggested that, these guys had a sort of vision of society, what some people call a communitarian vision of society. A vision of society that's an associational vision. Not a society where the state does everything, not a society where the market does everything, but a society where voluntary organisations and stuff like that do a lot of stuff. So this brings me back to this connection. What's the connection between the churches of Christ and groups like these? And what does this mean for Christian working class beliefs and politics? And what I'm thinking at the moment is that all my church's labour activists are centred in voluntary organisations and local government, where they can exercise control. So they're not orientated towards what the state can do. what the state run by what the Web's called middle class experts can do. Instead, they're doing it for themselves, and I find this quite attractive. Leicester's men were more idealistic than, say, W.T. Miller, my great-granddad. They're going for a sort of practical utopia. They're trying to create a little world. And they're influenced by secularist figures like Robert Owen, George Holyoake. They're influenced by other people. It's not all their own ideas. But there's also an affinity between what they're trying to do and religious ideas of congregational government, associational self-government, collective self-help. There's a lot of ideas coupled together that are driving this. I've not got too much longer to go. Now, so does this amount to a distinctive social philosophy? Now, if you ask Eric Hobsbawm, famous Marxist historian, no. And here's a quote from Hobsbawm, which I think is quite telling. He says, "There were indeed a few labour movements, notably the British, whose activists largely came from or passed through Protestant sectarianism and nonconformity, and some parts of which show an interesting confluence of religion and class struggle. But these movements also have the marks of archaism, and that means they're not going to last into the 20th century, they're part of the past. And in any case, there was no important working class Christian socialism, merely the standard socialism elaborated by secular thinkers and translated into familiar biblical technique." So what he's saying is they don't really adding anything. They might be effective leaders of trade unions, but they're not adding anything. But he goes on. I think this is another piece, actually. So Christian labourism, my question in a way is this sort of what I call Christian labourism. Is this a dead end, as people like Hobsbawm say, that they're sort of saying, well, let's get on to real socialism, let's not mess around with this stuff anymore. Or is it a missed opportunity? And again, Hobsbawm, popular faith had no social philosophy. Well, no, that's me saying, that's summarising. It was also totally untheological, unintellectual and emotional. It is characteristic of the working class sects that they were designed for the uneducated, so that passion and morality, in which the most ignorant can compete on equal terms, were the exclusive criteria of faith and salvation. Now, I thought that was a great comment for a Marxist to make about the working class. But even a more middle of the road person like McKibben, who's a sort of, he's a sort of left wing of the Labour Party type person. He says, the year 1931 also represented the failure of the autodidact tradition in British politics. The failure was also ideological. So hand it over to the educated middle classes, so they'll sort it out for you. Seems to be the message. So what I'm trying to do at the moment is and this is my last slide, what I'm trying to do at the moment is to look beyond some of these 20th century progressive historical narratives, So at the time when Hobsbawm was writing, it didn't seem silly to pretend that we're on a march to socialism. It just seemed rather silly now, I think. So the idea that you have to judge what these guys were doing as a stage on the transition to state socialism. Now, I don't think we should be looking at it like that anymore. Moreover, I don't think it's not just about autodidact leadership skills, moral character and discipline learned in chapel. That's important, no one doubts. They wouldn't have got to the top if they didn't have those things. And in fact, the irony is that some of the communist trade union leaders later, like Arthur Horner, got to the top for the same sort of reasons. They were good at leadership, and they were disciplined, and they were organised, and so forth. But I'm trying to argue that these Churches of Christ chapels were not unique or distinctive, but they were kind of a dissenting associational microcosm. They represented something that existed more widely in working class nonconformity. And this was to do with ideas about self-management of the chapel, about running things yourself, if you like, the radical idea of the priesthood of all believers. And so in a sense, what to finish, I'm just saying, with an independent working class Christian labourism, it's about ordinary people having voice, and it is a social philosophy, albeit in a very male world. And that's it.
Well, thank you for that run through the association of not just Churches of Christ, but non-conformity more widely, and even more. We've got some time for any questions or comments if anybody has one.
Yes, lots and lots of things have been whizzing through my mind through that talk, Peter, which I found very, very interesting. And one personal experience which I'd like to share is during the miners' strike in 1984, when the churches in South Wales in particular were, and the synod moderator of Wales for the United Reformed Church at the time, Revd Dr John Morgans, built a very close relationship with the local NUN. And as those people in the room who perhaps read John's diary will know, he became quite a significant partner to the leaders of the strike as a listening ear and accompanier to them at times of great pressure, and I was privileged to be in on quite a number of meetings with him during that period. So that was probably, in a way, a swan song moment. If you look back on it now, it wasn't just the end of the industry, because that's what it was, because the coalfield never really came back again after the strike. But it was also a recognition of how many of those collieries and South Wales Valleys communities had very, very strong relationships with their chapels, and been supported by the chapels in the strikes earlier on in the 20th century, in the 1930s, some of them. But needless to say, there were lots and lots of tensions within what was primarily then a middle class church and an urban church, which came back at the moderator, at John Morgans, and he was heavily criticised by elders of churches in Cardiff and the prosperous urbanised areas which were a world away from the collieries, and were largely led by people who felt they had progressed their lives and left that behind them, although they might well have been born in the valleys and had fathers and grandfathers who were miners. So this story, in a sense, has a strong emotional heft for me. And I think, although it is hard to talk about the role of the women, if you go to somewhere like the mining museum, which is also called Black Gold, which is in Tylerstown, you will find that there's a very strong role of the women in those communities, and that came up to the fore in 1984 during the strike. And the significance of women within the communities shouldn't be overlooked, although it's not an easy one to find and tell. So those are just my initial, quite emotional responses to what you shared with us.
No. I think the thing about, I'm not for a minute saying that the role of women wasn't significant,
No.
but it just wasn't. The bit I'm looking at is the sort of like organised labour movement, which is totally male, basically, in this period. Obviously, there's an interesting studies to look at what women did in those chapels. They were very patriarchal. They were often only men could hold certain positions and stuff like this. So there's an interesting question about that. I suppose the other thing something you've raised is, in a sense, I'm trying to get away from this sort of polarisation of ideas of self-help and collective self-help. Obviously, there is, you know, in a sense, people often, particularly a lot of radical historians, have rubbish people like Samuel Smiles' self-help as, you know, as sort of like an apologist for capitalism and all this sort of stuff. But most of these guys were involved in self-help. They were self-improving people, but they were also doing collective self-help. So they were organising a cooperative, they were organising a trade union, you know, they were organising all the chapel activities, which churches still do, don't they? They still organise these well, a lot of churches still do. They still organise a lot of these associational type activities. And so, in a sense, I want to try and bring those aspects of labour history back in, where working class people are active. They're not just waiting for the educated middle class to create the National Health Service.
Do friendly societies, mutuality, Oddfellows, and so on, is that some part of this jigsaw?
I think it is, yeah, because people would have used those types of organisations before there were. I mean, obviously there are various things that start to undermine this associational world. One is the growing role of the state, and you can debate whether, in some situations, things could have been done better without the state. But the other thing is obviously the development of mass consumer society, where you get, you know, alternative ways of doing things to friendly societies. You know, so you have a commercial bank instead of a friendly society or something like that. But I would put them part of the picture. Yeah, I was very much see them part of that picture. And I think you know, there's a danger of rubbishing a lot that aspect of Victorian society. I mean, obviously, no one's saying we didn't need more state. We obviously did need more state. We needed more state intervention and in lots of different areas and stuff. But at the same time, there are different ways of doing these things. It's not always the best thing to pass jobs over to a centralised bureaucratic state.
One of the arguments that was sometimes put forward for the popularity of Nonconformist chapels, sort of mid to late 19th century, was this was the only place that working class people could have some control over their lives, rather than be controlled by the works that they worked in, the mines, and they had no political voice, and so on. Do you see that's first of all, is that an appropriate conclusion? And if it is, does that linger into the 20th century, or is it a more positive approach from their point of view? Are they still just trying to have some kind of control somewhere, or are they genuinely motivated by their religious collectivism into social and political activity?
Well, I wrote an article from the PhD in 1996 in Journal of Ecclesiastical History, and that charts basically the Plattbridge Chapel. And what I show is that they have a very active associational life, including musical evenings, chapel outings. There's a whole little world going on there. Now there obviously are other things. There are other you know. I don't want to be sort of nostalgic about this. There are other things happening in society, like the development of mass entertainment and stuff, that are probably a threat to a lot of that associational type life and stuff. But yeah, I mean, I think quite well into the 20th century, there was quite a rich associational life in those chapels. There wasn't, to be fair, there wasn't a lot of competition at that time. You know, it was the pub or chapel, wasn't it? Yeah.
I remember reading one nonconformist minister complaining that once people had access to cars, they went to the seaside rather than to chapel on a Sunday.
I think that, to be fair, I think transport's an important part of the story. I mean, the interesting story about my granddad Ackers is that his family, his parents were inactive Anglicans, but the next door neighbour was a member of the Church of Christ at Albert Street, Newtown, and there were 10 kids. And he said, well, do you want me to take them round to the chapel? So that all 10 of them became members of the Church of Christ for the next generation. So I think there's a lot of that going on as well. Yeah. And people are much more dependent on what there is in short walking distance. Yeah.
I think listening to you, several of us have been going back mentally into our own parents, grandparents, great-grandparents. I'm thinking in my case of two congregational churches that were very certainly largely middle class, and they included Tories and Liberals. Now, my grandfather fitted in very well into that, except that he is exactly the sort, I think, that your grandfather Ackers and grandfather Miller were. And I'm thinking here, he found his niche, he also found his wife in Christian Endeavour, which was a place where Christian young men and women with a sort of mission urge could meet on equal terms. The other thing in his case is undeviating Labour politics, which he came to after his wife, was largely through the co-op movement. And here I accept what you say in listening to Kirsty about the male world, but the co-op had the Co-op Women's Guild, which was not motherhood and apple pie, it had much more bite to it. And my grandmother was very active in that.
And in what connected my granddad Ackers and my great-granddad Miller was that because they were the two coalfield chapels, they had chapel outings together. So that's where my granddad met my granddad Miller's daughter. So that's how the two families came together. I mean, there's another funny story actually, which you probably find quite amusing, is that after I think in the late 20s, but maybe early 30s, my granddad, who I use that expression they used to always use in my family, got on. My granddad had got on, and he moved to Leyland, so out of Wigan to Leyland, and there was no Church of Christ chapel there. There was a congregational chapel, and now my grandma went to the congregational chapel and became effectively a Congregationalist. My granddad always refused and continued going back to Wigan, and in fact took my dad at 16 to be adult baptised in Wigan, so there was a bit of a sort of family difference, I think.
I heard one other, David.
Thank you for what you've given us, Peter. I think one of the things that it's thrown up almost accidentally or in passing is the way in which so much of our history is determined by who happens to be writing it. And that is not the least true about the places where it's being written. One of the intriguing things about the development of local history, and I'm thinking particularly of the kind of local history that Hoskins developed at the University College of Leicester in the 1930s and 40s, was that it provided an opportunity for people in places which you might say the magisterial historians of the late 19th and early 20th century had passed by to tell their own story in their own way. And Hoskins, of course, does that both in terms of Devon, where he was brought up, and also in terms of Leicestershire, where he spent most of his life. And that also highlights the particular industries of those places, which, unless you know them, you don't know them. And so something like the fact that hosiery had a high proportion of women workers tends to be overlooked, and not least, of course, because for the most part they weren't unionised, or at least they weren't unionised early.
Yeah.
And actually, when you consider the trade union movement from the perspective of the 70s, 80s point when I was beginning my historical work, one was probably only about halfway into its significant history. You've got those trade unions that go back a long way, but most trade unions don't go back a long way. And that is a reflection of the way in which different industries were unionised at different times. And maybe, well, it certainly is, my deficiency, I've never read a history of trade unionism that has attempted to relate the development of trade unionism to the development of the economy. Now, you may find that a rather surprising thing for someone to say, certainly a historian to say, but I would like you to tell me some. Because it's a more serious point, I think, than most people on that side of the subject, many of whom these days I don't know, are actually prepared to face.
Yeah.
And it's a reflection of the structure of intellectual history as much as it is a reflection of what is happening in the subjects being studied or the areas being studied.
Yeah.
And I think we've still got a long way to go to reconstruct a genuine history of the people.
No, I agree with that on both strands. I mean, I've always been a realist trade union historian. So when Tony, part of my work was contemporary industrial relations. So when Tony Blair was in power, I was in favour of social partnership and stuff like this, and the idea that basically, which they've managed to do in Sweden and Germany, the idea you can have strong trade unions that also contribute to efficiency. So I was always part of that argument. Now I would argue a lot of these people were part of that argument. My great-grandmother Miller was part of that argument. They were not wreckers. They were not people who said we're going to smash up capitalism. They were people who wanted it to be humane but also competitive. And that's that partnership idea is an important idea. I think a book you might, because you come from Leicester, don't you, originally? I think a book you might find interesting is Bill Lancaster's book on Leicester. Bill Lancaster is a sort of Marxian historian, and he does want to get a transition to state socialism quite quickly. But to be fair to him, it's also a very good history, and he's got a chapter on the Churches of Christ in it. But also he shows another thing that I haven't really mentioned so far. In the boot and shoe industry, one reason why these cooperatives were formed, and one reason why the Churches of Christ were so successful, was because they were being de-skilled. So basically, people were bringing in big factories and de-skilling guys, and they didn't want to be de-skilled, they wanted to be craftsmen. So they formed their own cooperatives so they could carry on being craftsmen and stuff. So there is, as you say, very interesting dynamics about how skills and stuff change and how people have to change with them. Yeah.
The same thing is actually true of the shift from framework knitters to sort of modern hosiery and hosiery machinery, which of course is the other staple industry.
Yeah, the other thing I should have said is also in these industries there were always women working. I mean, in hosiery and in footwear there were quite substantial women workforces. I mean, in footwear basically the top jobs, the skilled jobs, the clickers and the lasters were all men. But then all the finishing jobs were women, and often there were factories out in the villages where women worked in Leicestershire. And there was a period in the 1920s that there is a certain amount of tension, and the women form a separate union because they're basically being excluded by the men. And so there are interesting gender dynamics in that industry. And other ones, I did work on carpet industry in Kidderminster and stuff. But again, the same thing. The weavers were men, but all the finishing jobs were done by women, and there was, the same sort of tensions within those industries. Yeah.
Well, I think we need to thank Peter again for his stimulating talk and for the discussion.